we'll get into the book later on, Anatol, but we can't really escape the pandemic. So how have the past few months been for you?
For me personally,
yeah.
Well, I mean, we've had it relatively easy in Qatar in the sense that the infection rate has been colossally high, but there it's possible to self-isolate, in compounds, if of course you are one of the better off expats. The infection rate, of course, in the workers' colonies, the migrant workers' colonies, has been enormous. But fortunately, the death rate has been very low because, of course, most of them are young men, and so that is the least endangered category. And of course, Qatar is relatively insulated in terms of wealth, and also is still praying that the World Cup goes ahead in 2022. And so we haven't yet suffered the kind of economic hardship or threat to the degree that's been true elsewhere. So, compared to other people in the world, I really can't complain.
Yeah. I read in, Adam Tooze did a review of your book in the New Statesman. And he said the following: this isn't a book about pandemics, but if Lieven had seen COVID-19 coming, one imagines he could have written much the same book about our current crisis. The politics of pandemics seem tailor-made for him. Now, you've talked about the nation state as the main actor on the international stage that's going to mobilize us to take action on climate change. Now, have you been impressed by the nation state's ability to deal with the pandemic?
Well, it depends on the state, doesn't it? I mean, what the pandemic has really tested has been a combination of state efficiency and state legitimacy. And some countries, including both authoritarian states and democratic states, have done very well, especially, of course, in East Asia. Other states, including both democratic states and authoritarian states, have done very badly. But I think, what the pandemic has illustrated, and yes, I think this also, does apply more widely, is the centrality of the state. Now, international institutions, played an important role in alerting people to the pandemic. They could, of course, had they been allowed to do so and been configured to do so, have played a bigger part in coordinating the response. But all over the world, we've seen that the things that needed to be done to contain the pandemic and to cope with its consequences have been done by states and could only be done by states. It's only states that can impose lockdowns. It's only states that can mobilize health services, if they have health services, to deal with the medical consequences and to save lives. It's only states that can close borders. It's only states that can impose limits on public gatherings. It's only states which can impose penalties for people breaking the restrictions. So yes, I think that the centrality of the state has really been emphasized by the pandemic. But what we're also seeing is, and now from some quite surprising sources, as a result of the new awareness created by the pandemic, but also, of course, the economic crisis coming, 10 years after or 12 years after the financial crisis of 2008. And you see a much, much stronger emphasis on social solidarity, which is another key theme of the book. The book is written very much in support of the idea of a Green New Deal. And now, you have the Financial Times has just launched a series, on the new social contract. Boris Johnson, amazingly, is trying to, adopt the mantle of Franklin Delano Roosevelt deal. Biden and people in the Democratic Party who only a year ago were sneering at the idea of a New Deal, and certainly have done very little indeed for the sake of social solidarity this past generation, are now very strongly talking in terms of this. And so, but of course, when one says social contract, I mean, if you look at the history of social contracts, by definition, these are within countries. They can only be within countries. They are, a set of specific arrangements and agreements, implicit or explicit, between a particular population and state institutions. So, I mean, there too, the centrality of the nation state is, I think, established. Now, this, it isn't something that one, should greet with joy. It would be wonderful, if one could realistically imagine, a real system of social solidarity, across the whole planet. But, I'm sorry, that's a fantasy. I mean, of course, one can urge greater and more effective aid programs, and one can certainly link those to the struggle against climate change. But the idea that existing countries are going to merge themselves, into one world society, I mean, that is not happening and will not happen.
Yeah, the book, like you alluded to it there, about the Green New Deal, and something I was thinking of was following the 2007-08 financial crisis. It spurred a decade of inaction on climate change, because we were dealing with the political repercussions of huge debts, and governments typically in this country went for austerity policies. Now, do you see the Green New Deal as being damaged by this, or do you see it in the opposite way, in that because states are spending so much money to help save their populations, that the Green New Deal is more possible?
Well, I think it's more possible. I'm certainly arguing for that. And I mean, what I think, the pandemic crisis, but also the immediate response to the crisis of 2008 shows, is that in a real crisis, which climate change is, though, of course, a slower one, the money can be found. In that sense, it is like wartime. In a real emergency, all sorts of things which seemed impossible a few months before turn out to be possible, because states can generate the money. Now, up to a point, of course, they can. I mean, you can't go on spending money indefinitely. And that's why, of course, any New Deal has to be state-led capitalism. There has to be, as so many people have argued, there has to be also a commercial basis for this, which of course is happening if one looks at how alternative energy has been made commercially profitable, through a combination of state support and technological advances over the past 20 years or so. But I mean, one thing I think one should say very strongly is that we must not repeat the mistake of governments after 2008. When the opportunity for serious structural reform was missed, when the opportunity, really to regulate and curb financial markets and money laundering, tax evasion was missed, when, yes, an austerity program was put in place, which has now been abandoned by the Conservative Party itself after it has done so much damage. And of course, it's necessary to say this because while in Europe, I think one is now seeing, real ideas of using the pandemic crisis for serious reconstruction, not nearly as green as I would like, but still, the basic idea is there. In the United States, the first enormous tranche of state aid to the economy, backed by the Democrats as well. Of course, I mean, some of it went into income support, and trying to compensate for unemployment, which is, of course, essential. But much of the rest of it was just poured into supporting corporations with no conditions at all. Money poured into airlines with no conditions for improving fuel efficiency and so on. Money poured into health management organizations with no conditions for social responsibility or any of this. Money poured into infrastructure, but once again, obviously under Trump, but no concentration on trying to improve public transport. So, I mean, especially in America, the risk that this opportunity will be lost is, very much there. Now, obviously, from that point of view, we have to pray that the Democrats win in November. I mean, I'm much more hopeful now of a Biden presidency. He's been making the right noises in a way that he certainly wasn't a year ago. He's incorporated people, onto his team who take this very seriously. There are, over the past generation, there have been real reasons to be disappointed and watchful of the Democratic establishment. And I think we have to go on watching them very, very carefully over this.
Just the last question about the president. Do you think, as epoch-defining and as serious as climate change is, do you think a parochial focus on it ensures that we miss other serious threats? So, for example, the World Economic Forum met at Davos earlier this year in January, and the topic of discussion was sustainable development, climate change. Greta Thunberg was there, Angela Merkel was there, and the pandemic had been, a novel coronavirus had been identified in Wuhan only a month before that, and yet it wasn't discussed. So do you think it's the case that a parochial focus on climate change can draw our attention away from things that are also serious?
Well, I see it a different way. I mean, first, states and elites ought to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. After all, we in the middle of the pandemic crisis, people are still writing what, in my view, is to a considerable extent hysterical and exaggerated stuff. About the great power threat from Russia and China. So, they haven't forgotten about that one. So, I mean, certainly, one should not allow the threat of climate change to distract from shorter term problems. But I think, you see, the other point about climate change, and this is, a point that has been made both by environmentalists, but also by some leading security analysts, including the Pentagon, by the way, is that because of the nature of climate change, this will, I fear to some extent it will anyway, because we've got to a point where, climate change is already happening, and creating bad effects. Those effects will get worse. The challenge is to prevent them from becoming catastrophic. But the point about climate change is that because of its nature and the way that it affects societies and economies, it will feed into a range of other threats. In fact, probably a majority of existing threats to states and societies will be made worse in one way or another by climate change. And among them, by the way, this is something I drew attention to in the book, which I wrote, of course, a year before the pandemic broke out, is the universal prediction that climate change will lead to the spread of tropical diseases northward and southward, to new areas. Not necessarily epidemic disease, but So it will do that. Of course, by undermining state economies, it will make poverty worse, unless we can put really serious measures in place to check that. And of course, in many parts of the world, these measures are simply not available to states because states are too poor. And of course, it's likely, within states elsewhere in the world, it will create new migration, which could have a very destabilizing effect. And it will, of course, create more migration to the West. And we've seen the politically destabilizing effects of this very clearly over the past 10 years. So the thing is, I don't think that climate change should be seen as a distraction from other issues. I think it should be seen as basically important to all issues.
No, I fully agree. We'll move on to the book. So it's called Climate Change and the Nation State, the Realist Case. So for people who aren't familiar with international relations terminology theory, what does it mean to be a realist?
It means two things. It means well, the best definition of it was by Hans Morgenthau, and he said that realism is an awareness of international relations as dominated by interests manifesting themselves through power. And these interests and this power are those of states. Realism is also to put the state first in international relations, but what I've tried to do in the book is also to apply that internally and to the issue of climate change. And interests in terms of state interests. Now there, of course, it gets complicated and nuanced because state interests can be the interests of narrow state elites, and one sees that very much in the West today as well, or of course economic elites. But one hopes, and this is the ideal and model, that democratic states, but also one could say authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states stemming, let's say very crudely from the Confucian tradition, like Singapore, for example, that they see the interests of the state in terms of the interest of the population as a whole. So of course the state has security interests, but that the fundamental duty of the state is to defend and advance the interests and the well-being of its population. So that is realism in a nutshell. But I mean, on a sort of in a looser way, realism is a recognition of the world as it is, rather than the world as we would like it to be. Now, that does not exclude a commitment to try to improve the world, to change the world for the better, but it recognizes the difficulties of this, and that, you know, in the end, there will always be both selfish individual, selfish collective class interests, and selfish state interests. These will always exist and have to be worked with or worked around, you know, if anything is to be achieved. And you could say that realism also goes back in the end to a view of human nature, which does not say that man is naturally completely evil, or that man is naturally completely good. But it does recognize that both of these elements, you know, exist in mankind, and one will get nowhere, you know, if one wanders around in a kind of pink haze, you know, believing that people and societies are naturally good if only, you know, some wicked ruler or wicked elite or, you know, wicked banks could be abolished. Reinhold Niebuhr, one of my great inspirations, who was a great realist thinker, but also a Protestant theologian, he had a very nice phrase about this. He said that man is naturally a lion. That's to say, he has in his nature, you know, impulses towards carnivorous ferocity. But he said, man is a a very strange and unusual kind of lion. He is a lion who at the same time can dream of living in peace with a lamb. So we also have this capacity, to dream and work for a better world. Anyway, that's my version of realism.
So why do you think the international initiatives on climate change, so the Kyoto Protocols in the 1990s and the Paris Accords in 2015, why do you think they failed?
A combination of short-sighted selfishness and political fear. Well, short-sighted selfishness, of course, above all through economic interests. But it must be said, economic interests, not just on the part of corporations and elites, but also if you look at resistance to fuel taxes, take France, resistance to higher taxation for the purposes of infrastructure building, take California. These were another vote against carbon tax in Washington state in the USA, and so forth and so on. Now, corporations may have played a part in propagandizing against the measures, but it was ordinary voters and citizens who in the end voted or demonstrated against them. And then on the part of the political elites, of course, fear. Fear that the measures necessary would lead to political unpopularity, which would lead in democratic states to them being voted out of office, or in authoritarian states to eventually to unrest and revolt. So those are the elements of it, of the failure.
What's crucial to the book is nationalism, and nationalism it's associated with quite an ugly form of politics usually. One that's quite hostile to outsiders, others. But you don't take the view that nationalism is something negative. And you divide them into two types, don't you? So it's ethnic nationalism, which focuses on ethnic identity, which is the more pernicious form. And then there's civic nationalism. Now, why is civic nationalism the force that can unite us around climate change?
Well, another word for civic nationalism is patriotism. This, I think, rather silly distinction has come about whereby patriotism is, supposed to be good and nice and so on, and nationalism as a whole is bad. But I've spent, long periods as a student and then as a journalist in India, for example. And in India, the liberal form of nationalism, represented by Jawaharlal Nehru, has always been called civic nationalism or Nehruite nationalism. So I don't, I find that a false, division in some ways. So when I say civic nationalist, you can understand that corresponds to civic patriotism or whatever. And well, two things, I suppose. One is that at heart, with obviously ecological concerns and climate change as an addition, I regard myself essentially as a mid-20th century social democrat, or in British terms, Labour Party supporter. I don't belong to that generation. I'm not as old as that, but I was a child of that generation, born in 1960. And, for somebody like Clement Attlee in Britain, or Ernest Bevin, patriotism was taken as a given. And it certainly didn't, and of course these were partly because, these were people who Attlee served as an officer in the First World War, twice wounded. And of course the whole of the Labour Party engaged completely in the struggle in the Second World War against Nazism and militarism. And those people would not have thought that, being a patriot implied hatred of other countries or other peoples or other cultures. It implied a strong commitment to your own country, society, including a very, very strong commitment to improve that society and to build social solidarity within that society. But the reason why I make so much of this in the book is that let's face it. Now, I say in the book very clearly, say again and again, I am not opposing and I'm not criticizing international institutions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the United Nations has played an absolutely critical role in spreading awareness of climate change and knowledge of the scientific facts and the evidence. Nor am I criticizing international agreements. Paris Agreement, they're absolutely necessary, nor am I criticizing international movements, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg as a figure, not at all. But when it comes down to it, all of these efforts are directed to getting states to act. States signed the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, states are failing to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, as previously, at Copenhagen and so on and so forth. Now, therefore, the key question is, how do you get states to act? And for that, you have to mobilize awareness and commitment among state elites, people with the power to change things, but also, of course, in populations, so that they will vote for the measures necessary, but equally importantly, they will accept without massive protest and reaction the measures implemented by states to limit climate change. And my argument is, but I really do feel that this has a strong, empirical base. The evidence suggests this. But if you're going to get state elites to act and state populations to accept and support the measures necessary, you really have to focus their attention on the threat to their own societies. What is climate change going to do, not so much to us, to me personally, but what's it going to do to our society, to my children, in the years to come? And the other reason why I stress nationalism from this point of view, civic nationalism, once again, is that one of the central problems which everybody has written about has been the difficulty of getting human beings to make sacrifices or even to pay attention to threats which will only become truly catastrophic after they are dead. I expect, even within however long I live, the next decade or so, to see the effects of climate change get worse. But I don't expect them to become really disastrous. You may see them becoming pretty disastrous by contemporary standards of disaster, but even you will not see, in the worst case, the apocalyptic consequences of climate change, which will begin to kick in the next century. 3 degrees becoming 4 degrees, becoming 5 degrees. So the question is, how do you get people, really to care about what happens in future? And well, one of the ways you do this is through a commitment to the nation, because the nation, by definition, is something which exists in and through time. As I point out in the book, the Great Seal of the United States does not say, the US Constitution is so like 10 minutes ago. It says a new order of the ages. In other words, America as a country, but also as a vision of how to organize politics, is something which is supposed to exist, which has existed for 200 odd years, 250 into the past, and is expected to exist for a very long time to come. So that is why I think that nationalism can play a very important part in the struggle against climate change.
What I thought was missing from the book, though, on your remarks on nationalism, was how you're going to be able to manufacture, mobilize it. So, there's various theories on nationalism. Ernest Gellner thought it could be manufactured through education. Benedict Anderson was the imagined community, the reading of newspapers. Do you think there are any ways in the 21st century to manufacture it, or do you just think nationalism's a latent force, so it just needs to be opened up?
Well, I think it is a latent force, both in good aspects, but also in bad aspects. I think we've seen very, very clearly, how bad actors can mobilize nationalism very, very effectively. Look at Trump. Look at some of the right-wing extremist forces in Europe. Look at Narendra Modi in India, and not that I think that these actors are nearly as bad as they've been painted, but look at how Vladimir Putin in Russia, and actually the Communist Party in China too, have really based their legitimacy on nationalism, on Russian and Chinese nationalism. So, I mean, that shows that. Now, none of them, simply didn't manufacture nationalism out of nothing. I mean, all of these forces have been around for a very, very long time. And I disagree with Gelner, by the way, on that. I just think that we have to try. And by the way, I mean, I'm not, a starry-eyed optimist about this. I fully recognize the difficulty. But since nationalism clearly is a very powerful popular force in so many countries, I think that it is a political imperative, I would say a political duty, to try to turn that in a positive direction and shape it in a positive way, rather than simply damning nationalism as a whole and hoping that it will go away. It won't go away.
You're also critical of claims. You're also critical of claims to get rid of capitalism. It's not an anti-capitalist book, this. Now, what would you say to people on the left who believe that we can only solve this problem if we throw away this profit-driven, callous system?
Well, I mean, first I'd say look at the record of the Soviet Union and communist China while it was still really communist. I do not think that you would find there, great examples of limiting pollution, concern for the, climate change wasn't really an issue then, but concern, for the impact of industry on the health of the population, or on the state of rivers or anything else. You won't, because these communist states were devoted to strengthening the state through industrial growth. So I don't think, I think it makes more sense to say that the whole of the modern world and modern economy, unfortunately, has been based on the exploitation of fossil fuels. Everybody of whatever kind has done that. But secondly, look, part of the point of the book is, trying to get people to project their thoughts forward into the future. I mean, the whole of the debate on climate change, or the whole of the propagation of action against climate change, has been based on that. Think about the future. Think how people in 200 years' time are going to look at us if we really make a mess of this. I would acknowledge that if in 200 years' time we have made a complete mess of this, and essentially modern civilization is collapsing, yes, I think people will say that the entire capitalist model was a disastrous error. But the point is, you see, who are we going to blame? You have to blame just about every state, well, certainly every Western state, but now East Asian states as well, communist states as well as capitalist states. You have to blame, and almost infinite number of scientists, businessmen, entrepreneurs, who had no evil intentions. Stevenson, and his steam engine, Watt and his steam engine, but we are where we are. And by the way, of course, if we hadn't had the Industrial Revolution, well, we would still be living in the early 18th century, which was very, leave aside, other parts of the world, that was very, very nice if you were an English aristocrat or, upper middle class as well. I mean, small things like antibiotics and anesthetics and so forth left aside, and even in the upper classes, you would expect to lose at least one child for every 3 you had. But let us not forget that this pre-industrial world looked a lot less wonderful if you were a landless laborer, or a poor inhabitant of the cities, or of course a slave. So the point is, we didn't create this world we're in, but we have inherited it. And realistically speaking, and this is where I'm a realist again, in my science fiction moments, and I'm a great addict of, well, I actually prefer not to call it science fiction, I prefer to call it speculative fiction. A writer like Ursula Le Guin is one of my great literary heroines, and I would love to see this modern capitalist world abolished and something totally different put in its place. But let us face it, if you make that the condition of effective action against climate change, there will be no effective action against climate change until it is much too late. And if you believe that out of the collapse of modern societies and modern civilization, you will inevitably or even probably get a wonderful world of ecological peace and community and all of this thing. You have not been paying attention to history. The overwhelming probability is that is not what we will get. So if you want to limit climate change, you want to keep it within reasonably safe bounds, we have got to work through the system that we have. But hence the New Deal, hence my endless references, to the creation of the welfare state in Europe, there have been successful examples of responsible state leaderships creating systems to limit and civilize capitalism, and the phrase I use in the book is to save capitalism from itself. Now, one cannot, like The Economist magazine or the Wall Street Journal, fantasize that capitalism will do this on its own. It never has. If it had been left to capitalism to regulate itself, you'd still have 7-year-old kids working down coal mines in Britain and elsewhere. And for that matter, you'd still have slavery. It's a very profitable system. No, there has to be leadership and there has to be a role for the state. But if we are to take action in the time available, this has to be through a reform of capitalism and not the abolition of capitalism. If the abolition of capitalism comes, it will only come as a result of the collapse of existing states and economies, and that will be accompanied by human suffering, on a scale probably, especially given the new numbers involved, never seen in the whole of human history.
Yeah, what I've always found astonishing about the debate on climate change is that people who claim to be conservatives, so you talk a lot about Burke in the book. So Burke said there was the relationship between the dead, the born, and the about to be born. And yet the threat is so grave that there's not going to be a future for people. So I don't understand why climate change has been dominated by the political left, and the right have either remained silent on it or they've been active deniers.
Well, I mean, one key reason for this is that the great majority of them are not conservatives. They're extreme free market liberals. Margaret Thatcher was not a conservative. No truly conservative person could have dreamed of saying that there is no such thing as society. You know, Burke would have burst out into incredulous laughter at that. No, I mean, and here I have to say as well, it is the impact of the United States, where, of course, the Republican Party has never really, I mean, it's had a conservative wing, but has never really been a conservative party in that sense. It's been an ultra free market liberal party. And also, I have to say, in America, if you look at some of the evangelical churches, where one does find a kind of often very extreme conservatism in certain moral and cultural respects, but you also see an absolute cult of capitalism, and attempts to portray our savior, as an American entrepreneur. They're not conservatives in that sense. But now, of course, you do see in Europe, you see this in green conservatism in Britain and elsewhere. You do see a move towards an awareness of the threat of capitalism, of climate change. And I hope that, together with this new commitment of the Conservative Party, what calls itself the Conservative Party, to state action and social solidarity, but one will see much more of this in future. I think that, however, a problem for true conservatives as well, if you take the late Roger Scruton, for example, has been, hostility to state leadership and, state domination. That is true, and that does apply to real conservatives as well. But that's why, I emphasize in the book the threat of climate change precisely to the nation, and why I do portray this not only as an issue of national security, but amongst other things, as an issue of national security. Because if you read Burke, indeed, I mean, Burke was always mostly hostile to state intervention in the economy, state regulation, and so forth and so on. But he made one great exception, and that was defense. It was national security. And one should remember, by the way, that in Burke's day, the Royal Navy was by far the biggest industrial undertaking in Britain. It was the biggest industrial employer and manufacturer by far. So, I mean, there once again, if you look at not just the two world wars, but, this is why I talk about social imperialism before the First World War, preparation for the threat of war, you had some very conservative people saying, the state has to intervene to protect the poor, to maintain social solidarity, because otherwise, faced with the real crisis in their day of war, our societies will fall to pieces, which is, of course, what happened to Russia during the First World War, happened to Austria-Hungary, and damn nearly happened to Italy. I emphasize that, among the very surprising supporters of the welfare state before 1914 were Kipling, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, and Winston Churchill, all of them conservatives.
Yeah, I'm aware that time's upon us, so we should talk about the future. We've talked a bit about the upcoming election in the US. I'm not going to ask you how optimistic you are that Biden will win. I'm going to ask you the more cynical question, I guess. How damaging for the future of the planet would a Donald Trump re-election be?
I think it would be extremely damaging. It would obviously stop state action, federal action in the United States on climate change dead. Will not just stop it, reverse it for 4 years to come. And there's been a lot of talk about how US states and cities can compensate for this, but I think the lessons are that yes, they can to some extent, but really major action on infrastructure, for example, the federal state is essential. But I think as well, you would see no attempt to restructure international trade towards bringing down emissions elsewhere. Trade would simply be seen in terms of the crudest American self-interest, with no other responsibility involved. But also, I'm afraid, not entirely. One sees, in social and economic policies. But I'm afraid in Europe, there is still a kind of blind instinct to follow the lead of on the right, on sections of the right, to follow the lead of the United States. And I think a Trump victory would strengthen right-wing populism in Europe, but also denial of climate change to some extent, but certainly in a damaging way. And of course, I fear there will be, Biden will also continue this new Cold War against China line. But I think Trump, would also risk being disruptive of the international system in ways that we've seen, already. So I pray that he doesn't win.
You're a hard-headed realist. So I'm going to ask you a bit more of a question about optimism. How optimistic are you that we're going to solve this problem over the next decades?
Well, one of my favorite phrases, I can't remember if I actually use it in the book, I probably do because I use it everywhere, is from Antonio Gramsci, that what is necessary is pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. One does see a certain tendency in sections, of the environmental camp, only sections, but, to lapse into despair, and to basically retreat onto ecological farms and like Noah. Except that Noah had a boat, these people don't, and let the rest, and just say, oh, the world is inevitably going to hell. I really feel very strongly that we have, we as educated people, we as citizens, we as people who think, about the world and the future of the world and the future of our own societies, we have an absolute duty not to give way to despair and to go on thinking and working in our different ways to try to make sure that this looming catastrophe does not happen. Now, we may fail, but the past is full of people who failed, but are nonetheless honoured by posterity for having tried. And I want my grandchildren ideally, I would like my grandchildren to be able to say, yes, my grandfather was one of those who contributed in his small way to the effort to limit climate change. And thanks to that effort, we live in a much better world than we would have otherwise. But at all events, I want my grandchildren to be able to say that my grandfather tried.